This morning in our training session, we're going to look at some of the purchasing functionality inside SAP Business One. So the first thing we're going to look at this morning is blanket agreements, and then we're going to go through the typical purchasing flow from purchase orders through to goods receipt purchase orders and AP invoices. And then we'll turn our attention to purchase requisitions and quotations, and then we'll have a look at freight charges and landed costs, and then finally we'll have a look at some purchasing reports. So let's jump straight into our purchasing blanket agreements. Now, for those who might be interested, we are on the SQL version, so this is not the HANA version. This is 9.3 patch level 5, so one of the latest patches that have been released from SAP. Except for a few minor enhancements to the purchase blanket agreement, the majority of what I'm going to show you this morning has been available in prior releases as well. So there shouldn't be any nasty surprises. If you do see anything that is a bit new and you're interested in upgrading, then please discuss this with your consultants. Right, so what is the purpose of a purchase blanket agreement? Well, it could be used for multiple reasons. The first thing that you might want to use it for is some sort of a control mechanism. If you want to have a prearranged way of controlling the item prices and quantities getting delivered to you by your supplier. The other is, of course, if you have a contract of some sort with your supplier. Now, typically in manufacturing environments where you need a commitment from your supplier to deliver specific quantities on time, on, let's say, a weekly basis, for example, a purchase blanket agreement is a good way of controlling that flow. The purchase blanket agreement, unlike the rest of your marketing document, starts up automatically in find mode. So always be aware of that. The first thing you always do is look at your button at the bottom left and make sure you're in the right mode. So, for example, on a purchase order, etc., you'd automatically be in add mode. So I'm just going to switch into add mode. And then I can choose my supplier either by typing the code or the name or by using my choose from list on the right hand side. Right, I could give this a reference number. It's not necessary, it's an optional field. I can also choose the method. So in this instance, I'm going to stick to an item-based agreement. I could go for a monetary-based one as well. I'm going to start it at today, and let's make it expire or end on the 30th of October. We could also optionally give it a description. So this could just be supplier contract number, etc. Okay. I also have the option of an agreement type. It could be a general agreement or a specific one. And general or specific affects the pricing mode as well. So I'm just going to leave it as general. I could also set it to specific and force pricing rules, for example. The next important thing is my payment terms and payment methods. Now, in my supplier master record, I do have a default payment term. I also have a default payment method that's been specified. On the blanket agreement, you are not forced to use the default from your supplier. And the reason for this is that typically on contracts, there might be a different payment method and a different payment term specified in the contract, for example. In this instance, I'm just going to set it to the same. Now, as mentioned earlier, there are a few new fields such as shipping type that has been added. On your version, the shipping type field might not be there, but this can be set once you get to your purchase order in any case. Right, I'm just going to set that to 100%. Next thing that's quite important is the status. Now, depending on whether or not you're using approvals, you could have this set as draft or approved manually on the document. You could also use the approval process to do approvals. So I'm going to set this to approved. And the next thing I'm going to do is go and add my items. I'm going to keep it simple and just use one item for now. We could add quite a few items, and let's say we're expecting 20 of these at a reduced price of $235. The usual price is $250 each. There's quite a few columns here, free text, where you can type in some extra text, for example, and very important whenever you're working with purchasing and sales documents is to have a look at your form settings and see if there are any columns that you might be interested in turning on or making use of. Also bear in mind that if you click and move your columns around, you can arrange or rearrange the sequence that these columns are displayed in. Depending on authorization, some users might not have access to form settings, and these settings might need to be set on their behalf. Right, so once you're happy with all of the columns and all the details that you needed to fill in, the next thing to do on a purchase blanket agreement is to right-click and go to Details. So another little tip on most of your documents, if you're looking for a feature or a function, it would either be on a right-click menu or under one of these two on top, Data or Go To. So for example, under Data, you'll see we have some shortcuts here. So if you're interested in switching to Find mode or Add mode without having to use your icons on top here, you could simply use a keyboard shortcut. And these shortcuts are on the menu on top here. So under the Go To or under the Data, there could be extra features for you. So in this instance, Go To Details is there. It's also available from my right click. There it is there. So under the details, I can now specify the frequency for the specific line. And so each line can have its own frequency within the same agreement. So this might be an item that I'm expecting weekly, and I'm starting this on 20 September. I'm just going to keep the dates the same to keep it simple. This item might have had a different time frame to it. Under the release column, this is a text field where I can type in some extra information. So I'm just going to type in limited to 2 pallets per week and put in my quantity, choose my warehouse, and keep it simple. I'm not going to go through all the features and functions today. I'm going to update that, and now I'm ready to add my purchase blanket agreement. Just going to run through the other tabs quick. We're going to come back to documents in a moment and show you, once we've started to consume against this blanket agreement, how it tracks and shows us the documents. Attachments, very important. If you do have a signed copy of a contract, for example, you could simply scan that into a PDF, or if you've got it in a Word document or in a JPEG format, for example, simply browse and attach that to the blanket agreement, and then you have the contract close by. You could also, in some instances, click and drag emails from Outlook into your attachments as well. So if you do have an email referring to this specific blanket agreement. Then there is another option as well, recurring templates. We're not going to look at recurring templates today. We won't have enough time for that. But if you do have a recurring transaction set up, for example, on a purchase order, you could simply apply that here and use that specific template as well. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and add my purchase blanket agreement. The next step is to go to our purchase order. And once again, I can use various ways of finding the supplier. I'm not going to go through all of that now. I know that it's V20,000. And right at the bottom, under my copy from options, is my blanket agreement. And there it is, number 4, the one I've just added. And I'm going to go ahead, and the first thing I've got is an option either to draw all the data or to customize. So once again, you're not limited with a blanket agreement to using it over a time period or a time frame. It could be a one-off where you want to use it as a control mechanism for one purchase only, and not specifically for weekly or monthly type deliveries. I'm not going to change anything. I'm just going to copy it straight in, and I've now used my purchase order. I could change the quantities. If I wanted to, I could muck about with it. Just going to keep it all simple for today. What I do want to show you is the relationship map. Now, when you go into a standard relationship map, it shows you your typical marketing documents. Your blanket agreement does not show up straight away. There's an option right at the bottom. So if we go down to our related blanket agreements, you'll see the blanket agreement is linked to this purchase order. Okay. And you could simply open that by double-clicking on the picture. And there we go. Under our documents, our purchase order has now been mentioned. And I've kind of broken away from the agreement by actually doing a manual change. Now, bear in mind that as a super user, I have the right to override prices, etc. Typically, we wouldn't allow users to deviate from the pricing. Okay. But there's our first link. So I'm going to close that down. The next thing we're going to do is to copy the purchase order into our goods receipt document. But before we do that, I just want to show you the impact on our stock. And important to note that at this point in time, my ordered quantity against the warehouse that's been used in this document would have increased. Okay. And there are reports that you can pull under the stock reports that will show you your committed, unordered, theoretical stock, your available stock. Okay. But somewhere included in that 25 is the 20 from my purchase order. We'll come back to this in a moment, and hopefully it would have dropped down by 20, and we should see an increase in the physical on hand. Right, so let's go ahead and copy that into our goods receipt purchase order. You'll notice at the bottom under my remarks that the origin is blanket agreement 4 based on purchase order 431. So as you copy from one base document to a target document, your remarks will follow on and copy across with each document for you. But there's also a few other columns, and once again, form setting is very important. And these columns will also help you track and trace where things have come from or where they've gone to in terms of base and target. So I'm just going to go ahead and tick all the target and base fields that are available to me. And if you have a look at the base type, you'll see that's purchase orders, reference 431, 431. Okay. Right, I'm going to go ahead and add this. In fact, there's one more feature I want to show before I do add that. There is the ability on the invoice, and I think we'll come back to that, to have a look at pricing as well. So let's go ahead and add this document. And if we just come back to that for a second, our relationship map has been updated. Our purchase order has been closed. We have a goods receipt that is open, waiting to be invoiced. So let's copy that into our AP invoice. But once again, you'll notice that the goods receipt has now been added to our remarks, and we now have a full traceability backwards of where this has come from. Similar to on our goods receipt, we can go and turn on our target and our base columns under our form settings. And if we scroll to the right, you'll see that the invoice is based on a goods receipt document. You'll notice the blanket agreement column is also filled in. Okay. Right, so if we right click on our invoice, you'll notice that there's another little line here called last prices, and this is a feature that very few people know about, and hopefully after today many of you will start to use this. Now, the purpose of this is to help you determine if you're paying the best possible price for this item. And what the last prices allows you to do is look at this item's price based on your vendor that you've selected here, or based on a different vendor altogether. So you might want to untick that specific vendor and say, show me this item based on any other vendor that I might have bought it from, or you might choose a specific vendor that you've bought this item from in the past and have a look at what prices you've paid to that specific vendor. So if I refresh, I can now see that I've paid the following prices over a period of time. Now, if you want to see the last 100 prices or only the last 2 prices, for example, you can change your display settings. You can also choose the transaction types that you want to see it on, And you could also look at whether there were any special prices based on any quantity breaks, for example. And you can also view any blanket agreements that are still open or closed or fulfilled, for example. If you see a better price somewhere on the line, to apply that price to the invoice, you can simply double-click and that price will get copied into your invoice for you. Okay, so a nice little feature if you want to double-check that you're getting the best possible price from a supplier on a specific item. Right, going to go ahead and add the invoice. And if we go back there, our relationship map will now show that our goods receipt has been closed off and only the AP invoice is still open. So this little lock tells me it's open. I haven't paid the invoice yet. Right, I'm going to go ahead and just close all these down. And what I could do is just from here go back to my blanket agreement. And if we have a look at it, we'll see we now have 3 transaction types that have been allocated against our blanket agreement, along with the pricing and the status of those items. The other thing I wanted to look at, if we open the invoice again, is what's happened to our stock item. And if we go back to stock data and look at the order, do you remember there were 25? We've closed off the 20, and the 1,025 has now become 1,045. So my inventory has been increased by the items that I've now purchased. Right, the next thing we're going to look at this morning is the purchase request and the purchase quotation. So we'll start off with the purchase request. The very first thing you're going to notice on the top left is that there's no field for supplier. Now the reason for this is quite simple. Typically when a staff member places an order for something, they might not necessarily know who the buying department orders it from. They might not know what the pricing is. They might not know about any volume discounts, any arrangements or agreements in place, etc. So to keep it simple, all you need is the user, if they are an SAP licensed user, or you could use an employee if you have your employees under your HR module. So I'm going to go ahead and request. I'm in this department, and you'll see all your departments are listed, and there's my email address, and I can pick whether it's an item or a service. So I might not know specifically what the item is. I could order it as a service, and the purchasing department would then go ahead and make any changes to that, hopefully before they do the actual purchase order. In terms of dates, there's an extra date on top called the required date. Now, obviously, the buying department is going to do their very best to ensure that the item or the service is delivered by the date that you require it. So I'm going to go ahead and put a date of 5 October. And I'm not going to do an item-based one. I'm actually going to just use a service-based one for today. And I need a consultant on site. Now, there is an extra column called supplier. Once again, form settings, very important. You can turn that column on and off. So if you don't want your employees or your users suggesting a supplier or picking a supplier, you can turn that column off and make sure that it's hidden. In this case, I'm going to keep it there. I might know who this actual supplier is. In this case, it's Anthony Smith. He's our consultant, and I'm going to go ahead and choose my consultancy fees general ledger account. And I've already spoken to him, and he's agreed to charge me $1,250 for those few hours of consulting. And that's the basic information that I need to, once again, provide. All I need to do now is go ahead and add. And in this instance, I've actually turned on an approval process. and this will go through to the buying department automatically. Now, if you don't want to use the approval process, you could, for example, use an alert, or you could simply train the purchasing department to monitor the open item reports and go in on a regular basis and see if any new purchase requests have been raised by staff internally. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a bit of begging on my approval, and off my request goes to the purchasing department for approval. So rather simple process, nothing too complicated about it at all. The next one we're going to look at is the purchase quotation. Now the purchase quotation has got two methods to it, and I'm just going to run past the first one. And in this instance, I could manually add as many quotations as I want, possibly for the same item, because I happen to know that there's 4 or 5 or 6 different suppliers out there who could potentially supply me this item. And all I'm doing is saying, I need this quantity, I need it by this date, what price can you offer me? And so we could go ahead and pick a supplier. In this case, the supplier is a foreign supplier in New Zealand, and it's asked me for an exchange rate. Required date, I'm going to put 3rd of October, and I need a rainbow printer. Now they haven't quoted me yet, but I can go ahead and put a quote date in if I have that. The system can forward in for me later as well. Required quantity, I need 5 of them. At this point in time, the document might have a 0 value for the simple reason that I don't know what the price is yet, and that is the whole purpose of creating a purchase quotation. So I'm going to go ahead and add that, and now I've got a purchase quote that I can always come back to afterwards and update either from here or just copy straight to the purchase order and give it the price in the purchase order, for example. Okay. So that was the first method. There's another method of generating the purchase quotations, and that is using the purchase quotation generation wizard. Now, in order for this to work, you need to have the suppliers already defined at your item level. So I'm just going to create a new one and just show that to you. So I'm going to base it on items. Now, interestingly enough, you could also base this on purchase requests that you've received from your staff. So you could put that out on tender or out on contract and send it off to multiple suppliers to quote. In this case, I'm going to base it on an item and give it a date, put in my item and the quantity that I require, and put in my valid date, also the warehouse where I'm expecting this item to be delivered to. And you'll notice that there's multiple suppliers that are going to receive this quotation. So if I go back for a second, the reason for that is that I have set it under my preferred supplier list. On my item master, I have set 3 preferred vendors. Once again, you don't have to have a preferred vendor if you're doing the purchase quotation manually. You can use any vendor and any item combination, even if that vendor is not listed on that item master. So let's just complete this process. Click on next. And I can choose to just execute, or I can choose save parameter set. By saving parameter set, I can reuse the same parameters again in the future. And 3 transactions have been created for me, 6, 7, and 8. Same item, 3 different vendors asked to quote on this item. But the next thing we're going to look at today is freight charges and landed costs. Now, before I get to the landed costs, I often get asked if there's a simpler way to handle costing in SAP Business One. And I'm going to show you one of the approaches that you can use without having to use the landed cost. Now, landed cost works very well if you have rather complex import processes where you need to take various costs such as insurance costs, freight costs, etc., and divide that across the items that you're bringing in. If you want to have a much simpler way of doing it, there is something called freight charges. Now, in order to use freight charges, the very first thing you do need to do is make sure that your freight charges have been turned on. And under your document settings on the first tab, the General tab, if you go about halfway down, you'll find a little tick box called Manage Freight in Documents. Now, once you've turned it on, you can't switch it off again once it's in use. So in this instance, I've already configured it and switched it on. Once you've done that, typically you'd have the Update button at the bottom, which you need to click on, and that will add the functionality into your SAP Business One system. Right, so I can go to the Freight Setup button from here. The other way of getting there is from Setup General Freight on the menu. So I'm just going to go ahead and use the little shortcut button over here. And what we're going to do is just quickly add two freight charges, and it will become clear as we go along why we need two of them, because we're going to do some offsetting in our document. So the first one I'm going to call landed cost, and it's going to get used on the purchasing side, so we're interested in an expense account. In this case, it's actually a liability account, a clearing account that I'm after, and I'm just going to go ahead and type that in on top. So a little trick, those of you that might not know, when you're on your search lists, you can search on any column by putting the focus onto that column. By default, you'll find is always on the first column. If you want to search on a different column, you can just simply double click on it, and in this instance, I'm now searching on the second column. So I'm going to go ahead and choose that account. In this instance, I'm going to set my tax codes to exempt. I don't want to claim the tax on the additional charges that I'm putting onto my main supplier. I do want to add that tax when I do the actual invoice from my freight clearing agent. But the next thing I'm going to do is skip these two columns. I don't want to charge any fixed amounts. I don't know what those amounts are going to be. They amounts to be determined in the future. This is quite useful if you do want to have, for example, a handling charge and charge every single customer a delivery charge or a handling charge, for example. But in this instance, we're not going to use that. We're also not going to look at gross freight or withholding tax at all. Distribution method, very important. In this instance, because we're going to allocate these costs on the row, I'm going to set it at the row total level. I'm going to leave the drawing method, which is from the header. We're not going to use the header today, so I won't be explaining this, but if you are interested in how these two methods work, please do discuss it with your consultant. We're just going to skip past it for now. Very important, on my first one, I'm going to tick stock. Now, what this little tick does is it tells the document to increase the cost of the item that I'm going to purchase. So on my purchase document, goods receipt or invoice, it's going to increase the cost of the item because I've told it that the specific freight charge has to be added as a cost. Okay. I'm going to update that and add the next one. So next one, I'm just going to call it landed cost offset. You can give these any names you want to, anything that makes sense to you. And I'm just going to use the same account. Once again, S2 and P2. And in this instance, I'm not going to tick the stock tick box. So what's going to happen is this specific freight charge will get posted to account 208060. I'm going to go ahead and update that. So now I've added my two freight charges. And let's go and see how that works on our purchase document. Now, something worth mentioning while we're talking about landed costs is the consideration of the timing. Now, when we talk about timing, if you're going to wait until you get your AP invoice and then do your landed cost or then do your freight charges, and you're using the goods receipt to receive the stock, bear in mind this inventory would have been receipted at your supplier's cost without the additional landed cost. And if you go ahead and sell or transfer or move that stock into production, for example, it's going to get moved at that cost at that point in time and not at the correct landed cost. So timing is quite important. So my suggestion is always to do your landed cost or your freight charges on the goods receipt where possible. I know sometimes shipping agents take forever to send you the invoice, and so you don't always have those costings available when the container is getting delivered at your warehouse. Right, so let's go ahead and pick a supplier and have a look at how this costing works. So I'm going to choose my item and then go back into my form settings, and just to make it a bit simpler, I'm going to turn off all those extra columns that we had and turn on my freight charge columns. Now, you have a limitation on the row level of using 3 different freight charges at the same time. So you'll see there's freight 1, 2, and 3. On your header level or on your footer level at the bottom, you do not have that same limitation. So at this level at the bottom, you could have as many of these as you want, and this is where that distribution total method would come into use. So anything you put at this level would divide into the rows or get spread across the rows based on the distribution method that you have selected. In this instance, I'm going to be allocating direct to the row. For my freight 1, I'm going to choose my landed cost, and I'm going to put in an extra value of $25. So the additional charges are around about 10% of what I'm paying my supplier. On my freight 2, I'm going to choose landed cost offset, and I'm going to set this one to a negative 25. Now, what are we trying to do here? Well, simply all we're saying is I'm buying a printer for $250 from the supplier, and I'm only going to pay him $250. I don't want to pay him the landed cost because the landed cost is getting paid to my shipping agent. So $250 plus 25 less 25 is still going to give me a net effect of $250 that I'm paying my supplier. What I've effectively done is added $25 with a stock tick yes, which should increase my cost to $275, and a negative 25, which should give me a $25 into my freight clearing account. Now, to clear that off, when I do a separate invoice to my shipping agent, that invoice will get posted to that same freight clearing account and should clear off at that point in time in the future. Okay. Now, before I add this, if I'm uncertain of whether or not it's going to work, there is this nice little feature called a journal entry preview. And if I click on that, if I get any red line errors, I know I've done something wrong. My count determination could be wrong. I might have forgotten to fill a date in, for example. And in this instance, it's come up with a serial number because this specific item is managed by serial numbers. So I'm just going to go ahead and give it a number and update that first. And now I should be able to get my journal entry preview. And there we go. So in my raw materials, which is my stock on hand account, $275 is going to get posted, which is the $250 I'm paying my supplier, plus the $25 I'm paying in landed costs, and I've now increased my stock value to $275. In this instance, it's not going to go direct to my freight clearing account yet because I am only doing a goods receipt and not an invoice. So let's go ahead and add this document. And now we go ahead and copy that into an invoice, and we'll have a look at our journal entry preview on the invoice, and you'll see that the freight clearing account will now get the $25. My goods receipt, not invoice account, will get cleared out, and my supplier liability is increased. Okay. And now all I do is simply add my invoice to the shipping agent, post it to the same freight clearing account, and it will clear off. So that in a nutshell is a quicker, easier way to get your landed costs into the system. So for those of you that don't want to use the landed cost functionality, looking for a simpler way of being able to get your costings correct, certainly can be done direct on the goods receipt using your freight charge columns. Let's go ahead and have a look at the landed cost functionality. Now, the landed cost functionality, as I said, is a little more complex for those who do need that complexity or need that complexity to be simplified back to an individual item landed cost value. And the first thing I'm going to show you is on the item master, we have the ability to define our duties, and under the purchasing data tab, there's a duty group, and you'll see at the moment we don't have any defined, but you could go in and define your various tariff groups that you pay your various percentages on, and put those various items and their charges directly into the item master. All this will do is suggest a duty automatically on the landed cost for you. It will give you a projected figure at the bottom, and you can then fill in the actual. So if there's a small variance between what your shipping agent or clearing agent has charged you versus what you projected, once you fill the actual duty in, it will go and divide that back into the rows and come up with the correct costing for you. Now, you don't have to do this. A lot of people prefer not to predefine their duties, and they prefer to put it in under the cost tab. So we're going to have a look at that method today. I'm not going to show you the duty method. So type in my supplier. Under the broker, we can also supply, for statistical reasons, who our shipping agent is. Okay, so I've got ABC shipping agents. I'm going to go and do a copy from. Now, as mentioned, you can do your landed costs on the AP invoice. You don't have to do it on a goods receipt. But once again, just bear in mind, if you're not using standard cost, for example, and you're using FIFO or moving average, that you are going to have an issue with your costing if you possibly go ahead and sell or release those items out of the warehouse before your landed cost has been added. So I'm just going to go ahead and choose a document. And what we're going to do is go into our cost tab. Now, there are two different types of costs that you can add. There's fixed costs and there's variable costs. I'm going to keep it simple today. We don't have too much time, and I'm going to show you the fixed cost method. Now, these specific landed costs have already been predefined. You can go to the button on the bottom right here called New Landed Costs and go and add additional types that you might require. Now, a simple example to illustrate why we need the allocation. Let's take a mobile phone, for example. You could have a beautiful new Apple iPhone XS, and I'm sure you're all as shocked as I am to see that these phones have landed at around $2,500 each. Very expensive. If you bought a container load of them and you mixed a few other products into the same container, and you were paying insurance based on value, then you would use the cash value, for example, for that. But if we consider that the iPhone is in a very small box, volume-wise doesn't take a lot of space, weight-wise doesn't have a lot of weight to it, we might have other items in the container that might be heavier, larger, bulkier, but are cheaper items, for example. And so certain of your costs, you might not want to base them on value. You might need to base them on quantity, weight, volume, or just divide the costs equally amongst all the items. Okay, so those are your allocation options that you have. Also important is your landed cost allocation account. Make sure this is filled. You will get errors if you try to add a landed cost without having that defined. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just put a few values in here just to illustrate how it works. So I've added an extra $50, and at the bottom you see under the total freight charges that the $50 has been added to my items, and now my items cost more. So my free on board was $7,200. I've now added some additional costs, and those costs will get divided into my rows. In this instance, I've kept it simple. I haven't got multiple items and multiple rows. I've only got one that I've used. Okay. It's also possible to add more than one supplier. So if you are interested, your consultants can show you. I'm not going to complicate it today and show you that. But if you do have, for example, 3 different orders from 3 different suppliers that you've put together into one container, for example, or that your shipping agent is clearing together for you in one go, it is possible to have multiple suppliers. Once you've done those multiple suppliers and added them in with their various goods receipts, this will no longer show one supplier. It will actually have asterisks there to indicate that you have a multi-supplier landed cost. Okay, but as I say, we're not going to go into too much details on that today. Right, you can, under the Details tab, go and have a look at your costings and see what your new landed cost will be, your new warehouse price. And under General, once we add, we're going to get a little link here to show us the actual journal entry. And once again, we also have the ability to do a journal entry preview. Okay, and then very important, where possible, use the attachments. Save your time and effort trying to find your shipping agent's documents, scan them in, browse, put them onto your attachment tab, and then in future you can just view them straight in SAP without having to go through lever arch files trying to find them. Right, so we're going to go ahead and just add this landed cost. And if we just go back to the document, under General, there is my link to my journal entry. And my additional cost has now been added into my raw material inventory account or stock account, my trading stock account, and my offset landed cost account has been increased. Okay. Now typically this should not be an expense account. This should be a clearing account, a liability account, for example, where you can absorb your supplier's invoice. And we're talking, of course, about your shipping agent's invoice when you receive that. And that's landed cost. But the next thing we're going to look at, and it's where we're going to end for today, is our reports. And I'm not going to spend too much time, but just quickly show you some of the options available to you. And I'm only going to look at two specific reports briefly. The first is the purchase analysis report. There's some flexibility in the options that you can use. So the first tab allows you to view it purely by supplier, and that implies that you will not see the item. So if I just go ahead and run that without changing anything, you'll see that we are viewing this by supplier. You can get details on any of your analysis reports by double-clicking on the row, and that will take you to a document level. But once again, I still do not know what items we purchased. I could, of course, drill in. And remember, SAP does have a 360-degree view, so you can keep drilling in, and you can go and view the items and drill into the masters, etc. from here. Right. But there is an option to view the items. So we'll select the item one, and now we can see it by item. And once again, you can double-click and see the documents against that specific item and get some graphs, etc. You can also have a secondary selection on your invoices, and you can filter it by a specific supplier group, or a property if you are using properties. Okay. You could also do a filter by a sales employee. Now, the wording is a bit confusing. SAP uses one table for sales employees and buyers. So in this instance, this is actually the buyer and not the sales person. Okay, but you can run this report and have a look how certain items are being purchased by certain buyers as well. You could also do it by the sales employee tab, and there once again you could also filter. The difference is this one's not going to give you the supplier information, it's going to give you only the sales employee. So this one is quite a nice one, the item-based one. You could simply set it to, for example, monthlies if you want to see multiple columns. Choose your posting period range, and you can do things like group by supplier or get totals by your sales employee. I'm not going to run through all of the options, but if we run this one and we just maximize it, my columns are a bit wide. Let's do this. Oh, there's only 1 month. I was wondering why I didn't see 12 periods. I don't have a lot of sales data in this demo database, or a lot of purchase information. In this case, I only got one column back. Let's unhide the empty months, and now we should be able to scroll across to the others. And I should be able to set that column width down a bit. There we go. And now we have 12 periods of information. Right, so that's the purchase analysis. As I said, we're not going to go into too much details. The other one we want to look at this morning is the open item list. And the open item list, in my opinion, is underutilized by many customers simply because they don't know how valuable it is. And it's kind of a storyteller in many ways. So if we look at purchase requests, for example, and we'll just start at the top of the list and work our way through them quick. If we have a document that's open here and it's quite old, chances are we skipped it, or maybe it was duplicated, or maybe the user forgot to go and close it, or we decided to not buy the item. Whatever the reason may be, these purchase requests are a little bit old. They're from 2015 and they should actually just get cancelled. Okay, so this tells us a story. This tells us how effective we are and how quick we respond to requests from our staff, etc., to place orders with our suppliers. The purchase quotations tells us a different story. This tells me that my suppliers are either quick at coming back to me and giving me the prices that I've requested and give me the terms and quantity breaks, etc., that I'm interested in, or they're taking too long to come back and I've got quotes open from last year or last month or 3 months ago, etc. Once again, if there's a document open here, you don't have to go into the link on the document to actually close it or cancel it. You can close these documents direct from the open item list, and this is really a handy little feature. So I'm going to go ahead and just close that one because I'm not expecting that supplier to quote me anymore. Let's have a look at the purchase orders. So if we look at our open purchase orders, I don't think any suppliers that we placed orders in 2015 are actually planning on still delivering to us. Or what might have happened is we have a staff member who simply went in, did a goods receipt and did not do the copy to or the copy from, and based the goods receipt on the purchase order. And that often happens in organizations. So very important, go through the open item list, look at what's open. Is it really supposed to be there or not? Now, from the purchase order perspective, very, very important to remember that this has an impact on your stock. And so if we go and have a look, and I've clicked on the wrong thing, let's go back to the document. So if we have a look at this document, these specific items on the stock data, it's telling me that I've got available stock. When I go into my sales and I make commitments to my customers, I'm promising them, yes, I have stock I can supply you. I have stock available on my available to promise report, or from just simply looking at the available column. In this case, that's not true. These orders are dated 2015. They've been forgotten, they've been duplicated, whatever the instance may be, they're never going to realize. And another nice feature, I can close multiple transactions at the same time. Now, to select multiples, you can hold your shift key and do top to bottom, for example. You can also hold your control key to select individual lines in between. So I'm just going to hold the shift, select all of the 2015 ones, and go close. And suddenly my open item list should look a lot better. There we go. A lot more realistic. And once again, if I go back into those item masters, that on order quantity has now been zeroized, and I don't have fictitious quantities available to promise to my customers. Very important. Right, goods receipts once again tells a different story. If I have goods receipts that are open for a long time, I have not received an AP invoice. Simple as that. My supplier has not given me an invoice, or somebody once again created an invoice without basing it on a goods receipt, and I might in this instance have duplicated stock, because an invoice without a goods receipt will also do an increase in my stock level for me. So that could be quite dangerous. This might be one of those where you need to investigate. Why is this goods receipt open? Was an invoice done without a goods receipt? Is this a partial open? And you'll see a column called original amount. So if the original amount is higher than this amount, it might be that you ordered 10, 9 have been invoiced, they didn't invoice you for the other one, or they possibly made a mistake and didn't know they delivered more than they actually did. Now, in terms of accounting, before anyone asks the question, SAP can handle closing these documents. And obviously, we've now increased our trading stock. We've given it a cost. We've posted a goods receipt. If we go ahead and close this goods receipt without passing it on to an AP invoice, then we could have a income that we need to declare, and SAP does have a account determination for that, and it will post that into that GL account for you when you close that goods receipt.